It was a cold, silent night in the middle of the ocean. The sky was full of stars. But on the dark water, there was fear. The Titanic, one of the biggest ships ever built, was going down. People were crying. Some were jumping into lifeboats. Others were holding hands, saying goodbye. The great ship was breaking in two. There was no music now. Only water, panic, and silence. The Titanic was called unsinkable. People believed nothing could destroy it. But on its very first trip, it hit an iceberg and sank. Over 1,500 people died in the freezing sea. It was one of the worst disasters in history. Why did this happen? Who was on the ship? What went wrong? This is the story of the Titanic. It is a story of dreams and mistakes. Of rich people, poor families, brave workers, and lost lives. A story that still touches hearts more than 100 years later. Today, you will improve your English listening and learn new words while exploring this powerful and emotional story. We will speak slowly and use easy words, so you can understand everything. So sit back, listen carefully, and get ready for a journey across the ocean and deep into history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to know. Let's begin the unforgettable journey of the Titanic. In the early 1900s, the world was changing fast. New machines, cars, and buildings were everywhere. People believed in progress. They believed that humans could do anything, even control nature. It was the perfect time for a big idea. In the city of Belfast, in Northern Ireland, a group of engineers and shipbuilders started a bold project. They wanted to build the largest, strongest, and most beautiful ship the world had ever seen. They called it the Titanic. The Titanic was not just a ship. It was a dream. A dream of power, comfort, and success. It was made for the White Star Line, a famous company that carried people across the Atlantic Ocean, from Europe to America. Their goal was simple: build the best ship on Earth. The work began in 1909. Thousands of workers spent more than 2 years building the Titanic. They used 3 million rivets and over 50,000 tons of steel. The ship was longer than 4 city blocks. It was like a moving city on water. The designers believed it was the safest ship ever made. It had special doors that could close if there was a hole in the side. It also had many rooms at the bottom of the ship to keep water out. People said, "Even God cannot sink this ship." It was a powerful statement, but also a dangerous one. Many rich people were excited. They wanted to be the first to travel on the Titanic. Poor families were excited too. For them, it was a chance to start a new life in America. The Titanic was not just a ship, it was hope. Men in suits, women in beautiful dresses, and children with bright eyes waited for the big day. The world watched. Newspapers wrote about it. Everyone talked about it. The Titanic was ready. But behind the dream, there were risks. The ship did not have enough lifeboats for everyone. Some people said it was too big to fail. Others believed no ship was perfect. But no one imagined what would happen next. The Titanic was more than a ship. It was a world filled with people from many places and many dreams. There were over 2,200 people on board, men, women, and children. Some were rich, some were poor, but all of them were going on a journey they would never forget. In first class, life was like a luxury hotel. There were large rooms with golden mirrors, soft beds, and private bathrooms. There were fine restaurants with music and fresh flowers on every table. Rich people walked on the deck, drank tea, and talked about business or travel. Some were famous. Others were simply wealthy and wanted to show the world they could afford the best. Second class was simpler but still very comfortable. Teachers, artists, and small business owners stayed here. They had clean rooms, good food, and space to walk and enjoy the sea. It was a place of calm and quiet, away from the noise of first class, but much better than what most people knew on land. Third class was very different. Many families from Ireland, Sweden, and Eastern Europe traveled in this part of the ship. Their rooms were small, and they shared bathrooms. But for them, the Titanic was a gift. It gave them hope for a better life in America. They smiled, sang songs, and dreamed about the future. Some had never seen a ship before. Now, they were sailing to a new world. Even the workers on the ship were part of the story. There were cooks, waiters, engineers, and cleaners. They worked hard every day to keep the ship running. Most of them stayed in the lowest part of the ship, far from the sunlight. They didn't have luxury, but they had pride in their job. There were all kinds of people on the Titanic. Old and young. Rich and poor. Each person had a name, a story, a reason to travel. But none of them knew what was waiting ahead. It was April 10th, 1912. The day had finally come. In the city of Southampton, England, crowds gathered near the port. People waved and smiled. Some said goodbye with hugs. Others took photos or cried quietly. The Titanic stood tall in the water, shining in the morning light. It was time to begin the first journey across the Atlantic Ocean. Passengers came with their suitcases, their hopes, and their dreams. They walked up the long bridge into the ship. For many, it was their first time on a boat. Children laughed. Women held umbrellas to block the sun. Men looked proud in their suits. Everyone was excited. At 12 o'clock noon, the Titanic's engines roared. Big clouds of smoke rose into the sky. The ship began to move slowly, leaving the port behind. People on land waved their hands, shouting goodbye. People on the ship waved back, full of joy. Music played. There was a feeling of magic in the air. The journey to New York had begun. For the first few days, everything was perfect. The weather was good. The sea was calm. The ship moved smoothly through the water. Life on board was like a dream. In first class, passengers enjoyed dinners with many courses, soups, meats, fish, and sweets. They danced in big rooms and listened to live music. They wore their best clothes and talked about the future. In second class, people read books, walked on the decks, and enjoyed quiet meals with friends. It was peaceful and pleasant. In third class, families laughed together. They played music and shared stories. Children ran through the halls. For them, this was already a great adventure. Everyone believed the same thing: the Titanic was safe. The ship was strong. Nothing bad could happen. But far ahead, deep in the cold Atlantic, danger waited silently in the dark. As the Titanic moved across the Atlantic, everything seemed calm. The sun shone during the day. The stars filled the sky at night. Passengers relaxed, ate, and laughed. But under the beauty of the sea, danger was close. The ship's radio operators began to receive messages from other ships. These messages said the same thing: there were icebergs ahead. Big pieces of ice were floating in the ocean. Some ships had to change their path. Some even stopped to wait. They knew the risk. But on the Titanic, people were not worried. The ship was new and strong. The captain, Edward Smith, was one of the most experienced sailors in the world. He had worked at sea for many years. This was going to be his final trip before retirement. He trusted the ship. Some say the Titanic was going too fast. The engines pushed the ship forward at full speed. Some officers wanted to slow down, but others believed it was safe. They wanted to arrive in New York early. They wanted to impress the world. On the night of April 14, 1912, the sky was clear, but there was no moon. The sea was quiet and dark. The water looked like glass. There were no waves, no wind, no sound. It was beautiful, but also dangerous. Without waves, it was harder to see icebergs in the distance. The men in the lookout area had no binoculars. They used only their eyes to watch the ocean. At 11:40 p.m., one of them suddenly saw something large and white ahead. He rang the warning bell and called the bridge. "Iceberg, right ahead." The officers tried to turn the ship and stop the engines. But it was too late. The Titanic was too big, and it was moving too fast. Seconds later, the iceberg scraped the side of the ship. There was no explosion. No fire. Just a deep, quiet sound like tearing metal. At first, many passengers didn't feel anything. Some didn't even wake up. Others felt a small shake. They thought it was nothing. But the truth was very different. After the iceberg hit, the ship began to change. At first, only the crew knew how serious it was. Water rushed into the lower parts of the ship. It moved quickly from room to room. The Titanic had special doors to stop water from spreading, but the iceberg had made too many holes. The ship was built to stay afloat with 4 flooded sections. But now, 5 were filling with water. The front of the ship started to go down. Slowly, but clearly. In the control room, engineers worked hard to understand the damage. Captain Smith walked through the ship with his officers. He stayed calm, but inside, he knew the truth. The Titanic was sinking. He asked the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, for advice. Andrews had helped build the Titanic. After checking the damage, he gave his answer. There is no hope. The ship will go down. It was hard to believe. This was the unsinkable ship. How could it sink on its very first trip? The captain gave orders to prepare the lifeboats. But there was a problem. There were not enough lifeboats for everyone. Only about half of the people on board could fit. At that time, the law did not require more. People thought lifeboats were only for short trips between ships, not for saving everyone on board. Many passengers still didn't know what was happening. Some were in their beds. Others were enjoying the last songs of the night in the first-class lounge. The music stopped. Lights flickered. Crew members knocked on doors, asking people to put on life jackets and come to the deck. Some didn't take it seriously. They laughed or waited. They thought it was just an exercise. Others became worried and rushed outside. In third class, it was worse. Many families didn't speak English. The way to the lifeboats was not easy to find. Some doors were locked. Confusion grew. Above, the officers tried to stay calm. They started putting women and children into the lifeboats. The rule was clear, women and children first. But there was no time to check everything. Some lifeboats left half full. People didn't want to believe the ship was really sinking. Meanwhile, the cold water rose inside the ship. It moved through hallways, kitchens, and engine rooms. It was quiet, but deadly. The Titanic was beginning to die. As the front of the Titanic sank deeper, panic slowly grew. The night was dark and cold. The sea was calm, but inside the ship, emotions were not. Some people were crying. Others shouted for help. Many still did not understand what was happening. The crew did their best to help. They gave life jackets to everyone. They opened doors and guided passengers to the lifeboats. Some people refused to go. They wanted to stay with their families. Husbands tried to get into boats, but were told to wait. Wives didn't want to leave without their husbands. Parents held their children tightly. The rule women and children first saved lives, but also broke hearts. In first class, some men stayed calm. They helped women into boats and shook hands goodbye. In third class, people ran, trying to find a way up. Many didn't know where to go. The stairs were crowded. Water followed them as they moved higher. Some crew members stayed at their posts until the end. The engineers continued working in the lower parts of the ship, keeping the lights on and the power running. They knew they would not survive, but they wanted to help others escape. On the deck, the musicians did something amazing. They kept playing music to help people stay calm. Violins, cellos, and soft songs filled the air. Some say the last song was "Nearer, My God, to Thee." No one knows for sure. But the music gave peace to many in those final moments. One lifeboat after another left the ship. Some were full. Some were not. People watched in silence as the Titanic began to lean forward. The back of the ship lifted slowly into the air. More than 1,000 people were still on board. Some prayed. Some sang. Others held each other close. Time was running out. But in the middle of the fear, there was also courage. People gave up their seats to others. Fathers kissed their children one last time. Crew members helped the weak and the sick. In the face of death, many chose kindness. The ocean was waiting. The last minutes of the Titanic were full of fear, cold, and silence. It was almost 2 o'clock in the morning. The front of the ship was deep in the sea. The back of the ship pointed high into the sky. The lights were still on. People could still be seen on the decks, holding on, waiting, or praying. Then, the lights began to flicker. The power was failing. The great engines were silent. The ship was now too heavy, broken, and weak. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the air. The Titanic broke in two. The sound was like thunder. People screamed. Some fell into the water. Others held onto the railings as the back of the ship stood straight, almost vertical, for a few seconds. Then, the second part of the ship began to fall. Slowly at first, then faster and faster. It disappeared into the ocean. And with it, over 1,000 souls. The sea was quiet again. But in the darkness, voices rose. The people in the water cried out for help. Many had life jackets, but the ocean was freezing. The water was like ice. People could only survive a few minutes before losing strength. Some lifeboats were nearby. They could hear the cries. But many were afraid to return. The sea was full of people, and they feared the boats would sink from the weight. Only one lifeboat turned back to search for survivors. It found only a few still alive. In the lifeboats, people sat in shock. They watched the place where the Titanic had disappeared. Mothers held their children close. Men covered their faces with their hands. No one spoke. The cold night felt endless. The stars were still in the sky. The sea looked calm again. But everything had changed. The unsinkable ship was gone. For hours, the lifeboats floated in the cold and dark sea. People waited in silence. Some cried. Some held hands. Others looked into the distance, hoping to see lights. Then, just before sunrise, someone shouted. A small light appeared far away. It was the RMS Carpathia, a ship that had received the Titanic's call for help. The Carpathia came as fast as it could, but it was far when the Titanic sank. Now, it was finally arriving. One by one, the lifeboats were found. The people on board were pulled up carefully. Many were frozen, shaking from the cold. Others were weak, too tired to speak. Some still cried for the people they lost. The crew of the Carpathia gave them blankets, warm drinks, and food. Doctors cared for the sick. The captain, Arthur Rostron, did everything he could to help. He moved fast and gave orders with calm and care. Out of more than 2,200 people on the Titanic, only about 700 were saved. The rest were gone, lost in the cold waters of the Atlantic. As the sun rose, survivors looked back at the empty sea. No ship. No sound. Only memories. They were alive, but their hearts were heavy. Some had lost husbands, wives, children, or friends. Others had seen the ship break and people fall. The pain was deep. The Titanic was not just a ship. It had become part of them. And now, it was part of history. The Carpathia took the survivors to New York. When it arrived, people were waiting at the port. Reporters, family members, doctors, and police all stood by. Some cried when they saw the lifeboats. Others searched the faces, hoping to find someone they loved. The survivors stepped off the ship slowly. They carried nothing but the clothes on their backs, and the story of what they had seen. The world was shocked by the news. People read the headlines again and again: Titanic sinks, many dead in cold sea, unsinkable ship lost. It was hard to believe. A ship so big, so modern, had gone down on its very first trip. Families waited for news. Some hoped their loved ones were saved. Others received sad letters or telegrams. All around the world, people felt the pain. The Titanic had touched many lives, even far from the ocean. Governments in the United States and England began investigations. They asked questions. Why did the ship go so fast? Why were there not enough lifeboats? Why were iceberg warnings ignored? Survivors told their stories. Some spoke in newspapers. Others stayed silent. Many said the crew did their best. Some said third-class passengers had a harder time escaping. The truth was complex. Many small mistakes had led to one great tragedy. After the disaster, rules changed. Ships had to carry enough lifeboats for everyone. Radio operators had to stay on duty all night. Ice patrols were created to watch for danger in the sea. The world had learned a painful lesson. People also started to see the Titanic as more than just a ship. It became a symbol, a warning about pride, speed, and believing we are too strong to fail. The words unsinkable now sounded foolish. No one is too big to fall. No ship is too strong for nature. But people also remembered the bravery. The men who stayed behind to help others. The musicians who played until the end. the people who gave up their place in the boats so others could live. In the middle of fear, there was also light. Years passed, but the memory stayed alive. Even after the ship was gone, the story of the Titanic did not disappear. People wanted to understand it. They wanted to remember it. And they wanted to share it with the world. Books were written. Songs were sung. Newspapers told the story again and again. Survivors were invited to speak at events. Some became quiet. Others spoke with strong voices, so the world would never forget what happened. In the years that followed, people searched for the Titanic's final resting place. For decades, no one knew exactly where the ship had sunk. It was deep under the ocean, more than 3,000 meters below the surface. Then, in 1985, a team of scientists finally found it. The ship was broken, but still recognizable. The bow was resting on the ocean floor. Pieces of furniture, dishes, shoes, and even letters were still there, untouched for over 70 years. Photos and videos showed the world what the Titanic looked like at the bottom of the sea. It was quiet, dark, and peaceful. A ship once full of life was now part of the ocean. The discovery brought the Titanic back into the news. Museums began to show items recovered from the wreck. People stood in line for hours just to see a simple cup or a child's toy from the ship. These small objects told big stories. In 1997, a movie about the Titanic became one of the most famous films of all time. Millions of people watched it. They cried, learned, and remembered. For many, it was the first time they heard the story in detail. The Titanic became more than a ship. It became a symbol of human hope and human mistake. A lesson in dreams, courage, and limits. Today, people still visit Titanic exhibitions. They still read the names of those who died. They still feel a deep connection to a ship they never saw. Because the Titanic was not just a ship. It was a moment in time. A story that still touches hearts all around the world. The story of the Titanic is sad. Many lives were lost. So many dreams ended in one cold night. But the story also brings lessons that still matter today. The Titanic showed us that even great things can fall. Even the strongest ship can sink. Even the richest people cannot escape nature. Pride and speed are not always signs of success. Sometimes, they are warnings. But the story also showed us something beautiful. It showed us the power of love, courage, and sacrifice. People gave their seats to strangers. Musicians played to bring peace. Crew members stayed behind to help others escape. In the darkest moment, there was light. The Titanic teaches us that human life is precious. It reminds us to care, to plan, to listen. It reminds us to respect the power of nature and the value of every person, no matter how rich or poor. Today, more than 100 years later, we still speak of the Titanic. We tell the story again and again, not just because of how it ended, but because of what it means. You, too, have your own journey. Maybe it feels big. Maybe it feels small. But like the people on the Titanic, you carry dreams. You face challenges. And you must make choices. Choose kindness. Choose courage. And never stop learning from the past. And now, we want to hear from you. Which part of the Titanic story touched you the most? Was it the building of the ship? The courage of the people? The rescue? Tell us in the comments below. And don't forget, subscribe to the channel so you can learn more stories like this and improve your English in a simple and powerful way. The Titanic sank, but its story lives forever. Do you want to improve your English 20x faster? Whether it's grammar, conversation, or fluency, we have the perfect material for you. Click the link in the description or the first pinned comment and take your English to the next level.